Hi, 5th graders. Welcome to Lesson 3.7, Estimate Decimal Sums and Differences. The essential question for this lesson is, how can you estimate decimal sums and differences? Now, go ahead and open up in your Go Math workbook to Lesson 3.7, found on page 65, and let's get started. Now, let's take a look at question number 1. As you can see, question number 1 has already been completed for us, but it's a good model of how to round to find a decimal sum. For question 1, what they give us is 5 38/100 plus 6 14/100. And the directions say to round to the nearest whole number, then add. So I'm going to start first of all with my 5 38/100. Now, there's some good reminders over here that I want to point out to you. The first part says, to round a number, determine the place to which you want to round. Well, what I know is, I'm going to round to the nearest whole number. And what I know is that I have a 5 sitting in that ones place. So my first step is going to be to put a circle around that 5, because that's the number that I want to round to. Now my next step is, I'm going to look at the number to the right of my 5, and that number is a 3. Now, another one of our reminders is this. If the digit to the right is less than 5, the digit in the rounding place stays the same. What I know is I know that 3 is less than 5. So that means my digit here, this 5, will stay the same. So what happens is 5 38/100 rounds to the whole number 5, because once again that 3 is less than 5. So that means that my number stays the same. Now I'm going to take a look at the second number given, which is 6 14/100. Now, once again, I need to determine the place to which I want to round. And what I know is this. I'm going to round to the nearest whole number. So I'm going to focus on the 6 in the ones place. So I'm going to put a circle around my 6. So here's my 6. Now I'm going to once again look to the number that is to the right of my 6. And that would be a 1. So I'm going to go ahead and underline my 1. Now, once again, what I know is this. I know that if my digit to the right is less than 5, the digit in the rounding place stays the same. Well, I know that a 1 is less than 5, so that means my 6 is going to stay the same. So 6 14/100 rounds to 6. Now, my last step is to add those two numbers together. So when we add 5 plus 6, our estimated answer turns out to be 11. Now, let's take a look at question number 2. The directions say to use rounding to estimate. And remember, once again, when you estimate, an estimate is just an approximation of the sum or difference. And in this case, it would be the sum because I'm adding those two numbers together. Now, for number 2, what they give us is 2 57/100 plus 14/100. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to round to the nearest whole number, and then I'm going to add. So I'm going to start out by looking at my 2 57/100. What I'm going to focus on is that 2 in the ones place. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I'm going to put a circle around the 2, because that's the place that I want to round to. And then I'm going to look to the number that's to the right of my 2. That number is a 5, and I'm going to underline that number. Well, what I know is, if my number is 5 or greater, it tells me to round up. So what happens is, I'm going to add 1 to my 2, and I know that 1 plus 2 is going to be 3. So 2 57/100 is going to round to the whole number 3. Now, let's take a look at this second number. I have 14/100. Now, I have a 0 right now in the ones place, and I know that that's where I need to round to. So I'm going to go ahead and put a circle around that 0, and then what I'm going to do next is this. So the 0 is where I'm rounding to. Now I'm going to look at the number to the right of my 0. That number is a 1. So I'm going to go ahead and underline my 1. Now, what I know is, I know that a 1 is less than 5. And if a 1 is less than 5, that means that my 0 will stay the same. So 14/100 rounds to the whole number 0. Now my last step is to add those two numbers together, and when I add 3 plus 0, my estimated answer turns out to be a 3. Now, let's take a look at question number 3. Once again, our job is to use rounding to estimate. Well, for question 3, they give us 9 and 65 hundredths minus 3 and 12 hundredths. Now, I'm going to focus first of all on the 9 and 65 hundredths. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on that 9 in the ones place. That's the number that I want to round. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a circle around that 9. Now, once I put a circle around that 9, I'm going to look to the number that is to the right of my 9. And that number is a 6. So I'm going to go ahead and underline my 6. And what I know about a 6 is this. I know that 6 is greater than 5, which means I have to round up. So what happens is I'm going to add 1 to my 9. And when I add 1 to 9, what happens is 9 and 65 hundredths becomes 10. Now, let's take a look at the second number. We have 3 and 12 hundredths. Well, I'm going to focus on the 3 in the ones place. And I'm going to put a circle around that 3. And once I put a circle around that 3, I'm then going to focus on the number to the right of my 3. And what I see is that number is a 1. I'm going to go ahead and underline the 1. And here's what I know. I know that a 1 is less than 5. And since the 1 is less than 5, my 3 is going to stay the same. So what happens is 3 and 12 hundredths rounds to the whole number 3. Now my last step is to subtract. So I'm now going to take 3 away from my 10, and when I do that, my answer turns out to be 7. So 9 and 65 hundredths minus 3 and 12 hundredths is about 7. Now, before we begin the next section in our lesson, I want to talk to you about what are called benchmarks. Benchmarks are familiar numbers used as points of reference. You can use the benchmarks, and these are going to be the numbers we're going to be using. You can use the benchmarks 0, 25 hundredths, 50 hundredths, 75 hundredths, and 1 to estimate decimal sums and differences. And this is what those benchmarks would look like when placed on the number line. We have our 0, 25 hundredths, that 5 tenths can also be written as 50 hundredths. You have 75 hundredths, and then the whole number 1. So we're going to use now these benchmarks to help us estimate our decimal sums and differences. Now, let's take a look at question number 6. Our job is to use those benchmarks to estimate. Now, what I've done over here is I've just written down those benchmarks, or those familiar numbers that we're going to be using as points of reference. And once again, those benchmarks are 0, 25 hundredths, 5 tenths, which is also 50 hundredths, those are two equivalent decimals, 75 hundredths, and also the whole number 1. Now, let's take a look at the problem given. They give us 12 and 54 hundredths plus 7 and 98 hundredths. And once again, our job is to use benchmarks to estimate, in this case, the sum, because we're adding those two numbers together. So I'm going to focus first of all on that 12 and 54 hundredths. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the decimal portion of that number, which is the 54 hundredths. And I'm going to go ahead and underline my 54 hundredths. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down below this problem and I'm going to rewrite that 54 hundredths. Now, what I know is this. I know that 54 hundredths falls in between 50 hundredths, or 5 tenths, and 75 hundredths. So I'm going to write those two benchmarks around that 54 hundredths. So I'm going to write, first of all, my 5 tenths, or I can write it as 50 hundredths. And then on the other side, I'm going to write down my 75 hundredths. Well, what I know is this. I know that 54 hundredths is closer to 50 hundredths than it is to my 75 hundredths. So that's going to be the number that I choose. That'll be the benchmark that I choose when I'm estimating. So what happens is 12 and 54 hundredths, when I use my benchmarks to estimate, is now going to become 12 and 50 hundredths, or I could write it as 5 tenths. Now, let's take a look at the second decimal number. We have 7 and 98 hundredths. Once again, I'm going to focus on that 98 hundredths first. So I'm just going to underline my 98 hundredths, and then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to write down that 98 hundredths. Now, what I know is 98 hundredths falls in between 75 hundredths and the whole number 1. So I'm going to first of all write down 75 hundredths as one of my benchmarks, and on the other side I'm going to write down the whole number 1. Well, what I know is this. I know that 98 hundredths is closer to the whole number 1 than it is to my 75 hundredths. So I'm going to choose that 1 as my benchmark to help me estimate. Well, when I add that 1 to my 7, that means 7 and 98 hundredths becomes the whole number 8. So I'm going to end up adding 12 and 50 hundredths plus the whole number 8. Now, to make my addition a little bit easier, I'm going to go ahead and put my decimal point and just make an equivalent decimal, just even things out. And when I add those numbers together, I end up with a 0 here, 5 here, I have my decimal, and 12 plus 8 turns out to be 20. So using my benchmarks to estimate, what I have is 12 and 54 hundredths plus 7 and 98 hundredths is about 20 and 50 hundredths. And we have now used our benchmarks to estimate. Now, let's take a look at question number 8. Once again, our job is to use benchmarks to estimate. And over here, you see that I have your benchmarks once again written down for you. I have 0, 25 hundredths. We have 5 tenths, which is also 50 hundredths. Once again, those are our equivalent decimals. We have 75 hundredths, and then we also have the whole number 1. Now, for question 8, they give us 16 and 18 hundredths minus 5 and 94 hundredths. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus first on the 16 and 18 hundredths. And I'm going to underline the decimal part of that number. And the decimal part is the 18 hundredths. Now, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to write down that decimal part, which once again is 18 hundredths. And what I know is this. 18 hundredths would fall between 0 and 25 hundredths. So I'm going to write those two benchmarks down. So on one side I have my 0, and on the other side I have my 25 hundredths. Well, what I know is 18 hundredths is closer to 25 hundredths than it is to 0. So I'm going to choose that benchmark of 25 hundredths for my estimate. So what happens is 16 and 18 hundredths using benchmarks to estimate now becomes 16 and 25 hundredths. Now, let's take a look at the second number that's given. We have 5 and 94 hundredths. And what I'm going to do once again is I'm going to focus on the decimal part of that number, which is 94 hundredths. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to write down that 94 hundredths. And then I'm going to choose the two benchmarks that that 94 hundredths falls between. What I know is 94 hundredths would fall between 75 hundredths and the whole number 1. So I'm going to write those benchmarks down on either side of my 94 hundredths. So over here I have my 75 hundredths, and on the other side I have the whole number 1. And what I know is 94 hundredths is closer to the whole number 1 than it is to the 75 hundredths. So I'm going to choose that 1 as my benchmark to use in my estimation. Well, when I add 1 to my 5, what happens is 5 and 94 hundredths now becomes the whole number 6. Now, my last step, based on this problem, is now to subtract. So when I subtract, 5 minus 0 is going to give me my 5, and 2 minus 0 is my 2, bring my decimal down, and 16 minus 6 is going to leave me with 10. So what I know is 16 and 18 hundredths minus 5 and 94 hundredths is about 10 and 25 hundredths. And that's how we estimate using our benchmarks. Now, let's take a look at question number 13. It's one of our real-world problem-solving questions, and number 13 says, Eliam bought 1 and 87 pounds of chicken and 2 and 46 pounds of turkey at the deli. About how much meat did he buy altogether? Well, as I read through that problem, what I notice is this. Eliam bought 1 and 87 pounds of chicken and 2 and 46 pounds of turkey. Then I notice the word about. And I know that about means I need to estimate. I also see the word altogether. And when I see the word altogether, I know that that means I'm going to add my two numbers. I'm going to combine them together. So my problem becomes 2 and 46 hundredths plus my 1 and 87 hundredths. And I know once again that I'm going to estimate because I see the word about. Well, let's practice our rounding to the nearest whole number skill. I'm going to start out by looking at my 2 and 46 hundredths, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to circle my 2 because that's the number, that's the place that I'm going to round to. Now, once I have my 2 circled, I'm going to underline my 4 because that's the number that falls to the right of my 2. And I know that a 4 is less than 5, and because 4 is less than 5, that means my 2 is going to stay the same. So 2 and 46 hundredths is going to round to the whole number 2. Now, let's check out the 1 and 87 hundredths. I'm going to first of all circle my 1 because I want to round to the nearest whole number, and then I'm going to underline the 8 because that 8 falls to the right of my 1. Now an 8 is greater than 5. And because that 8 is greater than 5, that means I'm going to have to round up. I'm going to have to add 1 to the 1 that I already have, and 1 plus 1 is going to take me to 2. So 1 and 87 hundredths is going to round to the whole number 2. So what I know is when I add 2 plus 2 together, it gives me an answer of 4. So what I know is 2 and 46 hundredths plus 1 and 87 hundredths is about 4 pounds of deli meat. Now, let's take a look at question number 14. It's another one of our real-world problem-solving questions, and number 14 says, Jenna bought a gallon of milk at the store for $3.58. About how much change did she receive from a $20 bill? Well, as I read through that problem, what I notice is this. The gallon of milk at the store cost $3.58. And I know that Jenna paid with a $20 bill. Now I also see the word about. And when I see the word about, once again, that means I'm going to need to estimate my answer. Now it says, about how much change did she receive? Now what I know is, if I'm trying to find how much change she received, I'm going to take the $20 that she paid with, and from that I'm going to subtract the amount of the milk, which was $3.58. Now, let's use our rounding skills once again to solve this problem. Well, what I know is, first of all, I already have the whole number 20. So I'm going to keep 20 just like it is, and I'm going to write that down as the whole number 20. Now I'm going to focus on my $3.58. Well, my job is going to be here to round to the nearest whole number, so I'm going to circle my 3. So we're going to circle the 3, and then I'm going to underline my 5, and I'm going to look at that 5 to determine whether I round up or stay the same. Now, since that number is 5 or greater, what that means is I'm going to have to round up my 3. So I'm going to add 1 to my 3, and when I add 1 to my 3, it's going to take me to 4. So what happens is 3 and 58 hundredths is going to round to the whole number 4. Now my next step is to subtract. So 20 take away the 4 is going to leave me with 16. So what I know is this, that $20 minus my $3.58 leaves me with about $16 in change, and that's going to be my estimated answer. Now, let's take a look at our homework questions for tonight. I would like you to complete question number 1 and question number 2, as well as numbers 3 through 6, found in your Go Math workbook on page 66. Don't forget, somewhere on your homework page I want you to let me know, do you feel like you're number 1 a novice, number 2 an apprentice, number 3 a practitioner, or number 4 an expert? Once again, don't forget, your homework questions for tonight will be to complete number 1 and number 2, as well as numbers 3 through 6, found on page 66 in your Go Math workbook. I hope you have a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow.